Hi everybody, my name is Hannah, this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a recipe to share with you today. We are inspired by this book called Arabesque, A Taste of Morocco, Turkey, and Lebanon by Claudia Roden. It is a beautiful book with tasty recipes. We have done several from this book so far, and I can't wait to do more. So today we're going to be doing these meat pies. They're really delicious, and I have changed the recipe just a little bit, so check the website at the blog post that accompanies this video so that you can find the original recipe. I'm mixing 1 cup of lebne with a 1/4 cup of water. This is just to get it a little bit thinner. And I'm going to be warming this up on low on the stove. You want to keep an eye on this. You don't want to get this too hot. While that's warming up, I'm going to prepare the rest of the ingredients. In a large bowl, I'm going to mix another 1/4 cup of water with a 1/4 ounce of active dry yeast, but you can use any yeast that you have on hand. Just follow the recipe and the directions on how to use that yeast. I've also added about a tablespoon of sugar, and now we're going to add back in that warmed up yogurt mixture and get it all mixed in. I'm also adding a 1/4 cup of olive oil, and we're going to put that aside for a second and work on the dry ingredients. I've got 3.5 cups of flour, and to that I'm going to add a teaspoon of salt. I'm using my measuring spoon just to mix this up really quickly, and next we can begin to add that to our wet ingredients. I'm going to add about half of the flour mixture into the yogurt, and I'm going to begin to mix it. Now, I'm following the recipe pretty accurately. However, when I make this, sometimes I am looking for a particular texture to the flour dough mix rather than the exact proportions. So this recipe is quite flexible, and you can go with a little bit more liquid if you'd like. It will take less time to rise if you do so. And if you're using warm liquid and warmed up yogurt, that will also decrease the time it takes to rise. I'm going to use my hands now just to get all of that extra flour incorporated. This happens to be a drier dough than I typically make for our breads and pizzas, but it is a really tasty dough because it has that yogurt. I'm going to drizzle with a little bit of olive oil, then set it aside for a few hours, and in the meantime, we're going to work on the filling. I'm going to be using 1 onion and a pound of tomatoes. I'm just going to use 2 tomatoes because I'm not sure how many are going to make up a pound, and my children aren't really crazy about tomatoes in this recipe. We also want to give this a rough cut, but I'm actually just going to use my NutriBullet to do this. I've used the wrong blade, so I'm going to change it up right now. This is going to pulse it down to almost a really fine liquid, and it recommends that you drain it. And I think that that's a really good option because otherwise your meat mixture is going to be too wet, but I don't drain it here. Next, we're going to cut up the tomatoes, and again, to keep the mixture a little bit drier, it's probably better to remove the seeds from your tomatoes. You can see there's a lot of liquid in there. So to this, I'm going to add 2 pounds of ground lamb. The recipe calls for 1.25 pounds, and also a few cloves of garlic. Now, I really like the garlic, and we added about 5 cloves. It's a little bit better just to mix that in with the onions to begin with. Now I'm going to add 1.5 teaspoons of allspice and about a 1/2 cup of pine nuts. We really like our pine nuts, but the recipe only calls for a 1/4 cup. We're also going to add 3 tablespoons of pomegranate molasses. I know this is probably a difficult item to find, but I highly recommend it. It adds a really nice flavor. We're going to season with salt and pepper, and now we're going to mix this in. You can certainly use your hands, but I prefer using a wooden spoon to do this, so it is going to take a little bit longer. But once that's all incorporated, then it's time to assemble our meat pies. I'm going to add a little bit of flour to my granite countertop so that I can roll out our dough. Because this dough ends up being a little bit drier, with the addition of the flour while I roll it out, it ends up making them even drier in the end. So in order to compensate for that, I would suggest adding a little bit more water to your dough mixture if you are using lebne. If you're using yogurt, it already is a little bit more moist. And the other thing is to only bake them for the 15 minutes that is recommended in the recipe. I ended up baking them for about 17 minutes, and I think that extra 2 minutes really dried out the dough. Now for this one, I'm going to make these nice circle cutouts, but I actually don't usually do this when I make this recipe for my family, but I did want to show you two alternatives. I'm going to use this dough a little bit later for a few more meat pies, but I also want to show you that when I typically make this, I usually just use my hands to form them into little meat pies. So it gives it a nice kind of rustic look. They're a little bit uneven, which I think adds to the taste and the experience of it. So I'm going to roll little balls, and even this is more than I typically do. I'll just grab a little pinch and then mush it down with my fingers. Sometimes I'll use the heel of my hand in order to flatten them out, and then put a bunch on the pan, and that's about it. I don't spend a lot of time making them even, and I also don't spend too much time trying to get them really thin. A little bit thicker actually tastes a little bit better, and it holds the meat really well, but too thick isn't a good idea because then they puff up too much and then the meat will slide off. All right, so I'm gonna just set these aside, clean up my surface, and then we're going to start putting our meat onto our meat pies. So I am taking about a tablespoon for each of these meat pies. Now you want to spread it all the way to the edge of the meat pie if possible, because your meat is going to shrink as it cooks. And if you just do it right in the center, you're going to end up with a lot of dough and not a lot of filling. So you want to get them to the edge as much as possible. Now these are going to be really moist, which means that you're going to have a lot of moisture kind of releasing from your meat pies as it's baking, and that might make it look like it needs more time to bake, but don't do that. Just follow the instructions on the recipe. That way you'll end up with a really nice, moist, fluffy dough. So we're going to bake those at 400 for 15 minutes, and this was actually for about 17 or 18 minutes, so you can see that it got a little bit crusty around the edge, and that tray was really hot, so it slipped from my hands, but it's all good in the end. We ended up making 23 meat pies with that recipe, with a lot of meat filling left over in the end. I highly encourage you to try these. These have been a family favorite of ours since we learned this recipe. It is really easy, and one more tip is that if possible, do try to use lamb. It tastes completely different if you use ground beef. Hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video. You can find that link down in the description box below. You can check out some of our other cooking tutorials by tapping on the screen right now. And if you want to see what we're eating on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.